So generally we've got some farmers ploughing a field years after the war, and they find all these sort of little bones that belong to the soldiers who were blown up, and you've got this really respectful language, like the china plates sort of, you know, highlights the fragility but also respectfulness, because that's quite an expensive, like finely wrought object. The relic of a finger, the chit of bone. And you've also got this idea of broken birds' eggs, so that the history or the potential of life that has then obviously been blown apart. It also represents the innocence and youth of the men as well. Obviously a bird's egg, it's like they were killed before they were allowed to come into the world properly because they were still so young. He really does capture the idea of the men being sort of told to not to run, to walk towards machine guns, and that's really emphasised by one of those longer lines there on line 8. Throughout the rest of it then, you've got this idea of eventually the men being buried in a grave, and they're all linked arm in arm. So you've got this celebration. It's kind of quite it's a nostalgic, and in a way it's quite an indulgent image, because the men themselves are long gone and they're not going to know this, but I guess it's kind of like a healing process for society, that if afterwards we can line these bones up and pretend that these men have had a good burial because they're all lying next to each other and they look like they're having a dance, you know, that society maybe is forgiven for what it did to them. That's possibly a cynical reading of it, and you might sort of suggest that the ending to the poem is really quite positive, that, you know, they look like they're singing and they look like they're all together now. Personally, I just find it a little bit too little too late, really. But Shears is definitely trying to get us to think that they've at least got a peaceful, restful end, and that they do deserve to be buried properly and respected. I think you've got as well this idea of time, and how over time these sort of foreign bodies in the soil will become part of the land, and it's only if people interfere with it that we can kind of dig things up and see how it doesn't have to be that way. You kind of got perhaps an idea that, you know, change can happen if you just seek it out and if you take the time to meddle with the earth, essentially. But that's maybe like a slightly different reading that you'd maybe look at thematically for place, perhaps. Okay, so moving on to the love poems, we've got Sonnet 43 at the beginning of the anthology. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who really wanted to marry a man that her father opposed. The relationship, this was at a time when traditionally at this time marriage was still seen as a transaction, as something that, you know, you marry a person because of their wealth or because they're in the same status of you. However, around this time was when people sort of started rebelling from that motion. So people started to value love not just as something you might feel with a mistress, or something you might feel that you never actually be able to do anything about, but society started to value love as actually something that mattered. And that was born from the romantic movement of valuing feelings over reason. So, you know, why would we get married just because we are being reasonable, pragmatic people? We'll get married because of our feelings, because we're in love. So this poem kind of reflects that about society at that time. It's not really a focus on why she loves him, it's a focus on how she loves him. So it's a focus on her feelings, and as emphasised by that first line, how do I love you? It's that word how is quite precise. She directly addresses it to her lover, which is very typical of traditional love poetry, and she kind of goes through all the different ways. Now this poem is considered to be one of the most sort of traditional love poems of all time. It's really quite sickening but there's also a bit of a mathematical feel to it, the way she sort of counts the ways and the depth, breadth and height. There's kind of like a methodical, logical approach that maybe suggests a little bit of logic within her love, that she does kind of see it as something that she is reasonably feeling, which you could say reflects this idea of breaching reason, which was the traditional view of marriage, with feelings, which was kind of the modern way of looking at love and marriage at the time. It's all there's a lot of abstract there, like my soul can reach when feelings out of sight, the idea that she feels like she'll love him forevermore, that her childhood will become part of their love. There's very much this feeling of all-encompassing that contrasts really heavily with the idea of Valentine, and perhaps even Cozy Apologia, where she remembers her past loves as being very separate, whereas in Sonnet 43 all of her old griefs and her childhood faiths are now embedded into him. It's not a particularly feminist poem because she very much sort of integrates herself with him. But it's certainly, like, I've been to a wedding before where this has been read out. It's very much still part of our society today as being heralded as why you should marry someone, that you feel this way about them or that you feel like you'll always love them. It's certainly not got any of the realism of modernism, and it's even got the typical references to sun and light, which is what's very traditional love poetry would have in it. I've also said there's personification of the soul, so it reflects how love takes us out of our minds and into that more spiritual place of feeling. So she kind of just really celebrates just what love does in itself, which nowadays we don't really appreciate, because of course that's what love does, that's what we see love as being. But in those days, like I say, that idea of love being that important, as opposed to just practically marrying someone for monetary reasons, you know, that was quite new. So she really just captured that time period and the way that love was becoming to be felt, I should say. Okay, there's loads of fluidity. It kind of symbolizes that she thinks they're all perfect and it's idealistic. I think nowadays, with our cynical modernist perspective, we might consider this to be hyperbolic and we might ridicule her, and that's something you can say, that, you know, from a modern point of view, it kind of falls short a little bit in because it isn't realistic. But it also is something that, you know, certainly, like I say, at weddings, it's certainly something that's taken to be a symbol of, here's a perfect love poem to show how I perfectly love you. Okay, so moving on to Valentine. Oh no, Living Space. Sorry, She Walks in Beauty. Sorry, Lord Byron, the bad boy of poetry. Obviously, contextually, he's definitely someone who you're concerned about this poor girl he's written this poem about, because he will destroy her. That's really emphasised by the last line, "A heart whose love is innocent." Quite interesting that he suggests that her heart owns the love. The innocent love is like her heart is mastering that, rather than it being in sort of part of her brain. It kind of makes her innocence seem really pure because it comes from her heart instead of a brain, which is more calculated and more shaped by society. Sorry, just skip to the end there. So She Walks in Beauty is the title itself. You've got loads of good analysis there, which obviously, because you'll have that title in your exam. So remember, it's really good to remember these. So she, that sort of, is talking about her. So again, this is probably the most anti-feminist poem in the entire anthology, because it just totally sees her as just what she looks like rather than as an actual human being, and he doesn't actually use her name. Walks in beauty. In is a preposition. It's like she's literally surrounded by her beauty. She's inside it, and that you don't actually see her because she's walking inside her beauty. Like her beauty is a case around her that stops you being able to access her. So it kind of really highlights this sort of very typical focus on looks. However, it's not necessarily criticism, because as a traditional romantic poet that Byron was, that certainly highlights that about him, that's just how it was done. That was what poetry should have been. So this links back to the troubadour poetry of like the 10th and 11th century, where love poems started to become about pining after an object that you will never have. So this idea of unrequited love was very typical for this kind of poetry. You didn't expect a marriage like Sonnet 43. The troubadours expected to never ever get to be with the person they were in love with, but they still wrote the poem to celebrate their beauty. Sorry, I thought my recording had run out and I was going to cry. We've got obviously loads of focus. There is some inversion, so we have got some subversion of a typical love poetry, in the idea that she compares him to the night. Sorry, he compares her to the night rather than the day. So there's a bit of originality there, but again, you could kind of say that links to Byron's sort of seedy nature, that he's more interested in nighttime activities. You've got the fact that she's the best of dark and bright, so her beauty sort of surpasses any restrictions of day or sort of mood. She is beautiful in all situations. And you've got some really sort of tender, there's a lot of loving words, like very gentle words, like tender, mellowed. Excuse me. The start of the second stanza really highlights, one shade the more, one ray the less, had half impaired the nameless grace. So nameless grace means it's traceless, like he can't really understand it, which I guess is a mark of true beauty. And it's a very romantic preoccupation, this idea that really elevating his subject to being something that's absolutely perfect. But this idea of that, if it was one shade the more or one shade the less, it's almost like she's a painting, like she's been perfectly painted, and if one little thing was out of place, it would make it more impaired. So in a way, you could argue that her beauty is obviously very fragile there because it's perfect, but it's also quite fickle, that just one little bit out of place, you wouldn't be so beautiful anymore. So there's two aspects to that, positive and negative. But I think, isn't everything that's precious quite fragile? Isn't that part of parcel? So you've kind of got this underlying idea of sort of darkness and light and how close together they are, and that is sort of embedded throughout the whole poem, that the idea of darkness and light never being a fine line between the two, and that you can easily pass from one to the other. Alright, now I've got Cozy Apologia, which I'm going to focus on it from just quite a straightforward point of view. I'm not going to go into any of my postmodernism stuff, because I feel like I've done that to death, and that is more grade 9 stuff anyway, grade 8, grade 9. But just to sort of focus on the general aspects of Cozy Apologia. So it reflects modernist poetry because it's quite... Let me just go through the verses first. So in stanza 1, you've got this kind of... It almost starts off in a clear subversion of a typical romantic poem. So in a typical romantic poem, you address the subject, which she does do, so that reflects it. But you compare them to the sun, and you compare them to all these crazy sort of natural large things, the moon, etc. Here, she compares them to a lamp, and she compares them to a pen. So you've got an inversion of that, and that's very modernistic, that she thinks that she looks at concrete ideas and she looks at realistic ideas. It's quite interesting though, because obviously a lamp is still tied to the sun, it's still a light source, but it's a light source that she probably relies more on in a modern age than the sun. Obviously she needs the sun to live, but in your house it's not the sun that provides you light when you need it, it's the lamp. Yeah, so it's kind of, in a way, it's more of a compliment to him to call him a lamp. You've got the pen exuding, which is quite a sexual image, and it's dry and matte, but then he's also glossy. So he covers all sorts of tones for her in life. And you've got this idea of, again, going from glossy to matte is this movement from an eros... Oh, someone just rang me. That was awkward. From an eros love to a pragma love, from the glossy, which is the sort of passion of love, to the matte, which is kind of boring, mundane love. You've then got the image of him being a knight for her, but really sort of protecting her rather than saving her, which I think is a key difference. But it still draws on these fairy tale images of a woman being saved and medieval imagery. By stanza 2, you've got this focus on the hurricane. So she brings us into her house where the hurricane's coming up the coast, and the hurricane's called Floyd. It's oddly male because usually hurricanes are female, and this hurricane reminds her of her teenage crushes. So because she's a writer, this is the kind of thing she thinks about. So she looks at the hurricane and she thinks about the swirling winds and the eye in the middle of the hurricane being empty. And she links that as symbolically to her childhood crushes, where she kissed boys but it would feel empty. So you had this whirlwind romance basically, where it was empty inside, it was lacking in substance, which also links to the licorice idea. It just damages you in the long run. And also it can get really boring because it's chewy. Okay, so you've kind of got, I suppose we're supposed to juxtapose this love that she had with those with the love she now has with Fred. And so there's really just a lovely image of you're bunking in your area and I'm perched in mine. So they're both doing different verbs, but there's still a sense of togetherness there. So they're not joined at the hip. There's not like Sonnet 43 where we feel like he's become embedded in every part of her life that she ever lived and ever will. They're in this moment together, but they're still very much detached doing different things. You've got all these sort of concrete nouns of the desks and the computers and the floors, and we fall short of the divine. So to me, the ending of this is very much tied to this postmodernism, which I won't go into, but the idea that she really celebrates just this simplicity of being comfortable with someone and being in love with them and spending your time with them and just being happy in a very, not in an exciting way, not in an extreme way, just being calm and content, and that should be news. That should be something we celebrate. When has the ordinary ever been news? Well, it should be. And I fill this stolen time with you. You've just got this lovely image that to me is transcendent. to feel that calm in someone else's company, but still have a good idea of who you are as an individual, and still feel like you can go back into your past and just explore how everything fits together in the world. That to me is a transcendent afternoon that she spent, that she really effectively captures in this poem.